Hi, this is Pam. In this video tutorial, I want to show you how to make the Cora Book Sleeve. Let's take a look at the supplies you'll need. Welcome to the September Sew-Along. The first thing I want to talk to you about are all the supplies and tools that you will need to complete these projects. And pretty much you'll need the same tools for each one of the projects that we're going to do in the September Sew-Along. Of course, you're going to need a pair of fabric scissors. These are from Missouri Star. I happen to love these scissors. I also like to have a small pair of like embroidery scissors that I keep right by my sewing machine. Helps for trimming threads, clipping corners, things like that. You may also find a seam ripper to come in handy. And if you want to finish your seams with pinking shears, you can have those handy. That's totally optional. These are from Dime Designs and Machine Embroidery. You may also need, and I highly recommend that you use a rotary cutter with an acrylic ruler and a self-healing mat. You may also find it handy to have a way to mark your fabric, such as with this friction pen. Okay, this tool here is a Hera marker. You'll notice that it has a very, I don't know what to call this, a very flat end here, and it is used for marking fabric without using ink, water-soluble ink, or a fabric marking pen. You literally press this down on your fabric and it leaves an indentation in the fabric, and you use that as your stitch guide. So this is a Hera marker. I really like to use this when I can, and I will leave links to all the tools in the description below. You'll also need a sewing machine needle. This is just a 90-14 sewing machine needle. You can use your regular presser foot, but because we'll be dealing with multiple layers, especially if you're going to use foam in any of your projects, I find a walking foot like this AccuFeed foot for my Janome machine that comes in really handy. You'll want some clips. They would just work so much better for holding your fabric pieces together than pens sometimes. And of course, some sewing pens. You may also find it handy to have a way to flatten your seams, such as this seam roller. And you'll want to have an iron. This is the Oliso M3 Pro Project Iron. It's a mini iron. And of course, an ironing surface. I use a wool pressing mat on a table that I made. You'll need thread. Whatever your coordinating thread is, I just use a polyester thread. I like this thread by Gutermann. You can use your favorite brand of thread. Of course, you'll need your bobbin. I like to have a few of those pre-wound. You may also find it handy to have a smaller acrylic ruler. This is really my favorite size. This is a 2.5 inch by 8 inch acrylic ruler. And other than your fabric, fusible fleece. What else are we using? Fusible fleece and a lightweight fusible interfacing such as Shapeflex SF101 I like to use. I already mentioned the fusible fleece. And some of these, like if you're going to make the book sleeve so that it holds your electronic device such as your iPad, you may want to make yours with foam instead of the batting or the fusible fleece. I like to use the Flex Foam by Pellon. There are other brands, soft and stable, that you can certainly use, but they make for a nice padding, especially when you're going to be stowing away your electronic devices in one of the book sleeves. And other than your sewing machine, I think that covers it for all the tools that you'll need. So we are going to sew together the Cora Book Sleeve. Now there are two pattern sizes that I made available. The medium, which finishes at 7.5 by 10, and the large that finishes at 9 by 12. You're only going to need about a 1/4 yard of fabric to make a book sleeve. So you will need fabric for the exterior, fabric for your lining, and then some type of batting, whether you use fusible fleece, foam, quilting cotton, Your options are whatever you prefer. Now, I do recommend if you're going to make the book sleeve for an electronic device, such as for your iPad, that you might want to consider using foam. Foam comes in both fusible and sew-in, and either one works just really well with these projects. Um, For your lining fabric, you could get by with a lightweight, such as Pellon SF101 interfacing if you want. For this one, I'm using fusible fleece on both the lining and the exterior fabric. I have already cut my fabric pieces for the medium at 8.5 by 11 inches, and for the large 10-inch by 13-inch, and fused my fusible fleece to the wrong side of my fabric pieces. Now be sure you follow the manufacturer's instructions for the type of batting that you're using. Here I am using a piece of fabric that I've added some 2-inch patchwork squares to. And I'm just using this to show you an example of how you can customize these book sleeves any way that you want. You can use contrasting fabric, like you'll see here in a minute of one of the book sleeves that I did, where I used cork fabric for the bottom of the book sleeve and cotton, quilting cotton for the remainder of the exterior, and then just a neutral print or solid for my lining piece. This is an example of the fusible fleece. You'll notice that one side is rough, the other side is smooth. The rough side is the adhesive. You will want to lay that face up and then lay your fabric face down, wrong side down on top of the fusible fleece and press into place. For the Pellon fusible fleece, you just hold your iron in place for about 10 seconds, lift up your iron, move it over, press it down again for 10 seconds until you've covered the entire piece of fabric. So now we're going to get ready to sew these pieces together, and you're going to see just how quickly you can make a book sleeve. So I'm starting with my exterior fabric pieces, and again, I have already fused my fusible fleece to the wrong side of the pieces, and I'm just using my Wonder Clips to line up the raw edges along the sides and the bottom, and I'm going to stitch that in place. Now I have allowed for a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you want, you could do maybe a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's totally up to you. But when you take this to your sewing machine and you sew it, you'll want to start on the top edge, back stitch at the beginning so that secures your stitches, stitch down to the corner, 1/2 inch away, raise your presser foot, pivot your fabric, stitch across the bottom. When you get to the other corner, 1/2 inch from the edge, raise your presser foot, rotate your fabric, and stitch up the other long edge. So here we go. I'm going to back stitch, take a few stitches, and then back stitch to secure my beginning stitches. Removing my clips as I go. I do prefer to work with clips, especially with thicker pieces of fabric like this, or thicker layers. When I get a 1/2 inch from the edge, I lifted my presser foot, rotated my fabric, and I'm stitching across the bottom. Again, stitching a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll stop 1/2 inch from the edge. Maybe one more stitch, rotate, and then stitch up the other long edge. And again, I'm going to be sure to back stitch when I get to the end so I can secure those stitches. And removing my clips as I go. Like I said, I like using clips because of the thickness of these layers, and they're just so easy to work with and remove as you stitch along. Okay, so we have the front piece done. I'm going to clip my corners, just the two bottom corners. I'm going to clip them diagonally. Okay, once I have clipped those corners diagonally, I'm going to also clip the sides just a little bit longer, as you can see here. That would just help me to get sharper corners when I turn this right side out. Just like that. Be careful not to cut into your stitching though. Okay, and that is the exterior fabric piece. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn my exterior fabric pieces that I've sewn together. I'm going to turn them right side out through the top opening in my sleeve. So just reach my hand in, grab a hold of the bottom and pull it out through the top. Push those seams in real well, especially if you're using something like uh, faux cork or leather or anything on the bottom piece. You'll want to be sure and poke that out really well, push that out. I'm using a bone folder tool here to help me push out the corners. And there I have my exterior piece sewn together. I can take this over to my ironing board and iron the seams flat. And next we will repeat that same process with our lining pieces. So lay the two lining pieces right sides together. The fusible fleece sides or interfacing sides are facing out. Line up your long edges and your bottom edges, so your sides and your bottom of the sleeve lining piece, and then pin or clip those together. Once you have those pinned or clipped together, you will again take them over to the sewing machine and sew using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now for this lining piece, we are going to leave an opening about 3 inches in the bottom of the lining piece. So we'll start stitching along the side just like we did. Pivot around the corner, stitch over just a couple of inches, stop, move our stitching over about 3 inches, start stitching along the bottom again, rotate and up the side. Let's take a look. Remember, when you get to the bottom, you're only going to stitch maybe an inch or two, back stitch, leave an opening about 3 inches, and then continue stitching along the bottom. When you get 1/2 an inch from the corner, you'll raise your presser foot, pivot your fabric, and then continue stitching up the other side. And be sure to backstitch at the end so you can secure your stitches. And then we're just going to trim those corners just like we did for the exterior fabric pieces. There's my bottom. This is my corner. It's hard to see the stitching because it's white on white, but just be sure you don't cut into your stitching when you trim those corners or clip those corners. And I'm doing the same thing where I'm coming back in and extending where I'm trimming on each of those corners. And then I have my opening here. And then I've left my lining piece wrong side out. I'm going to insert my exterior piece with the right side facing out into the lining piece. I'm going to open up those side seams, kind of open them flat, and line up each of the side seams, and then clip those in place. Okay, once I have my lining pieces lined up and the seams are nice and open and laying flat, I'll just clip those together. You could also use pins if you don't have clips. And I'll repeat that with the other side seam. Now I'm running this video nice and slow so you can see exactly what I'm doing. And we can kind of sew this together real time if you want. Now I'll line up the other raw edges of the top of the book sleeve and clip those together. All right, once I have that all clipped together, I'm going to remove the extension table off my sewing machine so that I have just this arm, which will make it more convenient for stitching the top of the sleeve together. If your sewing machine doesn't have the extension table, that's fine. You'll still be able to do this. I recommend that you lay your book sleeve down so that you're working and stitching on the inside instead of the outside of the sleeve like I'm doing here. If you have questions about that, just leave them in the comments and I'll explain that a little more. So again, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and I'm just making sure I've got my edges all nice and lined up here. And then I will stitch around the entire perimeter of the top of the book sleeve, which will stitch the lining to the exterior fabric. Just remove my clips, making sure that my seams are nice and flat when I stitch over those. And I'm using the opening in the lining to grab a hold of the bottom of the exterior piece so I can kind of pull it down to better line up the raw edges of the back of the book sleeve. Now I have that done and we're ready to turn our book sleeve right side out through the opening in the lining piece. So just grab a hold of the bottom of the exterior fabric piece of the book sleeve and pull it through that opening. It should just slide right through. And then turn your lining piece so it's kind of right side out, smooth out that seam. And then what you'll do is you'll fold that seam allowance inward and pin or clip that in place and then stitch across it. You can do a blind stitch, stitch it by hand so that you don't see the stitching, or just use your sewing machine to stitch about 1/8 of an inch or less away from that edge to close that opening. Okay, so again, I'm using my clips to just hold that opening closed. Then I'll take it to my sewing machine and stitch that. Again, be sure that you back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitches to secure your threads, and then trim any long threads. And then you're just going to push that lining back into the book sleeve exterior piece. Just use your hand to push that inside. Once you have that pushed inside, next we're going to do some top stitching around the perimeter of the book sleeve. So I'm just putting some clips all the way around. I'm kind of working, making sure that seam is nice and flat across the top edge. And then I'll take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3.0 millimeters. You could do 3.5 or 4, whatever long that you want. But this is just a top stitching. It helps to hold that seam down, and it adds a nice touch, finishing touch to your book sleeve. Again, I'm going to secure my stitches. My sewing machine actually has a locking stitch, so I'm going to use that. And once I've stitched the locking stitch, I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the book sleeve top all the way around, making sure that that seam is nice and flat as I go and that I don't have like more of the lining sticking up or the exterior fabric sticking up, and that it's all nice and flat and even. Remove my clips as I go. When I get back to where I started, I will again use a locking stitch to secure my stitches. Then I'm going to stitch a second time, about 1/4 of an inch or so, 3/8 of an inch from that folded, from that top edge, from where the seam is, and stitch a second row of stitching around the top edge. Again, secure my stitches at the beginning and the end, and stitch around the entire perimeter of the book sleeve. This will create a second row of top stitching. And again, I'm using a 3.0 millimeter stitch length. You can use any stitch length that you like. I just like the longer stitch length when I'm doing my top stitching. I'm securing my ending stitch, removing any threads. These are just the tail ends of the thread. And there we have a finished book sleeve. You literally could do this start to finish, cut your fabric out, sew it up, and have it done in about 30 minutes. And you can customize them any way that you like. Now, the medium book sleeve will hold a paperback book like you see here. The large will hold a hardback book. Don't forget that if you have signed up for the September Sew Along, to please share your progress on Facebook or Instagram and to tag me using the hashtag September Sew Along. Thank you for watching the video tutorial. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And come visit me over on Hooked on Sewing blog and sign up for my newsletter if you haven't done that yet. Thank you. Just a reminder that this video tutorial is part of a September Sew Along hosted by Hooked on Sewing. The Cora Book Sleeve was the first project in the Sew Along. The second will be the Pearl Tote Bag, and we'll finish the Sew Along with a Patchwork Christmas Stocking. I will leave a link below to join the Sew Along